Wonderful. Now I've got both my hands full. Let's dive in. And thank you again for your opening session, the first talk here. This is quite a lot to follow along on, but I hope I can at least inform and enlighten and provide some nice insights into some of the work that we're doing in Sweden. And to start with, having attended 3 of these conferences now in person, 1 online, it's quite nice to be talking about gender in a context where we're actually seeing numbers being quite a bit more balanced than they have even just the last couple of years, or over the last decade or so. But in this context, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who aren't here right now. One, because she's on maternity leave, which is quite relevant to what I'm talking about. And the other, Emma, who's really leading our gender research within our team. Being more senior than me, is responsible for teaching at the moment. And so, apologize for them not being here, but I'd like to thank them for the contributions they've made to the work. And all the good stuff in here, that's them. All the mistakes, I'll take that as stuff that I've done. So it's been mentioned quite a lot in presentations yesterday, plenaries, discussions in the workshop. What we want to know about who's fishing is quite important for a lot of reasons. Managers need to know this to shape policies to achieve outcomes people want, to achieve regulations they'll follow. We need to know who fishes for all sorts of purposes, and that's very important. But when we're collecting data on the human dimensions of recreational fisheries, we often face problems where we're seeing fisheries that are just data poor. We haven't collected data on them, but where we are collecting data, we find problems like non-response, undercoverage, leading us to miss out on programs and nature boards work at, there's been quite a few groups working to include refugees, minority groups into what is quite an important part of Swedish Scandinavian culture, the being outdoors, the open air lifestyle type thing. Where I am based on Gotland, there aren't as many refugees just based there, but nationally in the country they have been similar to organizing events to bring children into angling and the outdoors, bringing in these groups that have been, I think, quite successful on like the scale that they're able to operate, which like has existed and is quite good. Definitely, and that's one of the like big discussions we're like coming out of just looking at this at the descriptive level. These like motivation scales that we're using, these questions. Like, yes, there's differences, but is that actually remotely representing what's there? And the like nature orientation that people have. That's one area we want to look into more. Is like, you know, we know that there are these differences, but are we even asking questions that can capture that appropriately? And the like bigger discussion, like the like workshop that we had on Sunday, are we framing things in the right way to feed into these models? And yeah, we want to all use the same model that we've been using because we can compare the data, but if we're missing stuff in the initial questions, so what do we have to add in extra questions, but also how can we do that without survey burden, and if it is still a small group of female anglers, that we can't ask the same few hundred people every time, otherwise they're not going to give us good responses either. So yeah, definitely.
Things like, you know, asking women sort of that do fish, but also women that don't fish, and the question of why don't you fish? Challenge that.
That would be a great one to do. And we recently published a piece looking at differences in groups between like the general public and members of this angling association that we often survey. But we didn't, and I mean, this was a survey that was actually done quite a while ago, but we didn't include that, and that would have been fantastic, especially just for figuring out also non-response. It's not just the participation, but that like, all right, we know there's this many of you, but are you not engaging in the activity, or is it just like other things? And that would be fantastic to know, especially thinking about the projection that there's going to be greater engagement in the activity. It'd be really useful to have.